David Morrison was having his morning coffee when he heard the mail truck pull up to his cabin. He wasn't expecting anything important, just the usual bills and junk mail. But when he walked down his gravel driveway to check the mailbox, there was a certified letter waiting for him. The kind you have to sign for. The kind that's never good news. He tore it open right there by the mailbox, and his stomach dropped as he read the first few lines. The Mountain View Homeowners Association was ordering him to remove his front gate. Not asking, ordering. He had exactly 14 days to tear it down, or they'd start fining him $100 every single day until it was gone. David stood there staring at the letter, completely confused. His gate? The simple wooden archway he'd built at the entrance to his property 12 years ago. What could possibly be wrong with that? He walked back up to the cabin, reading the letter more carefully. According to the HOA, his gate violated something called community aesthetic standards. Every structure on the property needed architectural approval from the board, and his gate had never been approved. Therefore, it had to go. The thing was, David had built that gate long before any HOA existed. When he bought this cabin 12 years ago, there was no homeowners association, no rules, no board of directors telling people what they could or couldn't do with their own property. He'd spent 3 entire weekends building that gate with his father, hand-carving little scenes of deer and birds into the cedar posts. It was one of the last projects they'd worked on together before his dad passed away 5 years back, and now some people he barely knew were telling him to destroy it. David grabbed his phone and found the number for Karen Westfield, the HOA president. She answered on the 3rd ring, her voice bright and professional. She was a real estate agent who'd moved to the area about 5 years ago, and she'd somehow ended up running the whole HOA within a year of joining. "Hi, Karen. This is David Morrison from the end of Whisper Creek Road. I just got your letter about my gate." "Oh yes. David, I'm glad you called." Her tone was friendly but firm, like a teacher who's already made up her mind. "We need to get that gate removed as soon as possible." "But I built that gate before the HOA even existed," David said, trying to keep his voice calm. "It's been there for 12 years. I understand, but the covenant applies to all structures regardless of when they were built. We have to maintain standards for everyone's property values." David felt his jaw tighten. "Karen, that gate doesn't hurt anyone's property values. It's just a nice wooden archway with some carvings. Half the people in the neighborhood have told me they love it." "That's not the point," Karen replied. "The point is that it was never approved through the proper channels. If we let you keep an unapproved structure, then everyone will want special treatment. We have to be fair. Fair would be recognizing that my gate existed before your rules did." There was a pause on the other end of the line. When Karen spoke again, her voice had lost some of its friendliness. "Mr. Morrison, the board has made its decision. You have 14 days. I suggest you start making arrangements." She hung up before he could respond. David sat down at his kitchen table, the letter still in his hand. He couldn't believe this was happening. His cabin was at the far end of the development, the most remote property in the whole area. He bothered no one. His gate was 100 feet from the road. You could barely even see it unless you were turning into his driveway, but apparently that didn't matter to the HOA. He thought about just ignoring the letter. What were they going to do, really? But $100 a day added up fast. That was $3,000 a month. He couldn't afford to be stubborn about this, even if it made him furious. Still, something bothered him about the whole situation. When he'd bought the cabin, his real estate lawyer had mentioned something about the property. Something unusual in the deed. What was it? David got up and walked to his small office at the back of the cabin. He kept all his important papers in an old filing cabinet his dad had given him. He started pulling out folders looking for his property documents. It took him 20 minutes to find the right file. Inside was his deed, the survey map, and all the paperwork from when he'd bought the place. He spread everything out on the desk and started reading through it carefully. The cabin itself sat on 2 acres of beautiful land right by the lake. That's what he'd bought it for, the peace and quiet and the view. But as he read through the legal description in the deed, he noticed something he'd completely forgotten about. His property wasn't just the 2 acres where the cabin sat. There was another piece, a separate parcel, listed in the deed. A small strip of land across Whisper Creek. David pulled out the survey map and traced the property lines with his finger. There it was, highlighted in yellow. A narrow piece of land that ran along the creek, and right in the middle of it was Whisper Creek Bridge. The bridge, the only way in or out of the entire Mountain View development. He sat back in his chair, his mind racing. He owned the bridge? How had he forgotten about that? He kept reading. The original landowner back in the 1970s had subdivided his big property into lots for the development, but he'd kept the bridge separate. David's cabin had been the original homestead, and when the old man finally sold it in the 2000s, he'd sold it with the bridge parcel attached. There was something else too. An easement agreement. David read through the legal language slowly, trying to understand it. Basically, the easement gave everyone in the development the right to use the bridge to access their properties, but the bridge itself still belonged to whoever owned this particular piece of land. To him. David pulled up the HOA's documents on his computer, the ones they'd sent out when they first incorporated 3 years ago. He'd barely glanced at them at the time, just annoyed that someone was trying to create more rules and fees. He searched through the PDFs until he found the part about common areas. The HOA had listed the bridge as a common area. They thought it belonged to all of them, or maybe to the county. But they were wrong. The bridge was his. He sat there for a long time staring at the documents. His mind was spinning with possibilities, and not all of them were good. He didn't want to be that guy, the one who causes problems for all his neighbors. He just wanted to keep his gate, the one he'd built with his father. But if the HOA was going to play hardball with him, maybe he had some leverage they didn't know about. David picked up his phone again and scrolled through his contacts until he found his lawyer's number. Linda Chen had handled his property purchase all those years ago. She'd know what to do. He hit dial and waited. When she answered, he didn't waste time with small talk. Linda, it's David Morrison. I need you to look at something for me. It's about my property deed and an easement. I think I might own something the HOA doesn't know about. What kind of something? Linda asked. David looked out his window at the wooden gate standing proudly at the end of his driveway. The only bridge out of this whole development, he said. There was silence on the other end of the line. Then Linda said, "Send me everything you've got. I'll call you back in an hour." David hung up and started scanning documents. He had a feeling the next few weeks were going to be very interesting. Linda Chen called David back in less than an hour, which told him she'd found something interesting. Lawyers don't rush unless there's a reason. "David, you need to sit down for this," she said as soon as he answered. He was already sitting at his kitchen table, but he didn't point that out. "What did you find? You own the bridge. Not just own it, but you own it outright. The easement gives the other property owners the right to use it, but that easement has conditions." David felt his heart speed up. "What kind of conditions?" "Let me read you the exact language," Linda said, and he could hear papers shuffling on her end. "The easement grants perpetual access rights to all properties in the Mountain View subdivision, provided that such access does not interfere with the grantor's quiet enjoyment of their property. The grantor reserves the right to revoke this easement with 90 days written notice if conditions are not met." "In English, please," David said. Linda laughed. "In English, it means you can take away their right to use the bridge if they're messing with your ability to peacefully enjoy your own property. You'd have to give them 90 days notice, but yeah, you could shut down the bridge." David stood up and walked to his window, looking down the long driveway to his gate. "So if they're forcing me to tear down something on my own property, something that doesn't hurt anyone, that could count as interfering with my quiet enjoyment?" "A judge might see it that way," Linda said carefully. "But David, before you do anything drastic, you need to understand what this means. Without that bridge, there's no way in or out of Mountain View. The next creek crossing is 12 miles around the lake on a dirt road that's barely maintained. You'd be cutting off access to what, 40 families? 38, David said. He knew because he'd counted them once when the HOA first sent around their fee schedule. 38 families who would suddenly have no way to get to their homes, except by driving an extra hour each way. Their property values would tank. Some of them might not even be able to sell if they wanted to. "I don't want to hurt anyone," David said. "I just want to keep my gate." Then try talking to them again. Show them what you found, but present it as leverage for negotiation, not as a threat. Maybe they'll be reasonable once they understand the situation. David thought about Karen Westfield's tone on the phone, the way she'd dismissed everything he said. And if they're not reasonable? Linda was quiet for a moment. Then you have options. But options and good ideas aren't always the same thing. Think carefully before you escalate this. After they hung up, David spent the rest of the afternoon reading through every document he could find about the property and the easement. The more he read, the more certain he became. This wasn't some technicality or loophole. He legitimately owned the bridge, and the easement genuinely had conditions. He didn't want to be the bad guy here. He really didn't, but the HOA wasn't giving him any choice. They were demanding he destroy something that mattered to him, something he'd built with his father in the last good summer before cancer took him. That gate wasn't just wood and nails. It was memory and love and craftsmanship. If they wouldn't be reasonable, maybe they needed to understand that he wasn't powerless. The next HOA meeting was in 4 days. David decided he'd go and try one more time to work this out like adults. He made copies of his deed and the survey map, highlighting the relevant sections. He practiced what he'd say, trying to find words that were firm but not aggressive. The meeting was held at Karen Westfield's house, a big modern place she'd built 3 years ago. When David arrived, the living room was already packed with about 20 residents. He recognized most of them, though he couldn't say he really knew any of them well. He kept to himself mostly, which was the whole point of living at the end of a dirt road. Karen called the meeting to order and ran through the usual business: complaints about someone's dog, discussion about repaving the community boat launch, an argument about whether they should plant flowers at the entrance sign. David waded through all of it, his folder of documents on his lap. Finally, Karen got to new business. I want to remind everyone that we have several outstanding covenant violations that need to be addressed. Mr. Morrison, you're here about your gate? David stood up. I am. I wanted to present a compromise to the board. Karen's expression didn't change. We've already made our decision. Please just hear me out, David said. He kept his voice calm and friendly. My gate has been there for 12 years without causing any problems. It's well maintained, it's attractive, and it doesn't block anyone's view or access. What if I agreed to stain it to match your approved color palette? Would that be acceptable? A few people in the room nodded, but Karen shook her head immediately. We can't start making exceptions. If we let you keep an unapproved structure, what's next? Everyone will want their own custom additions. The rules exist for a reason. Tom Bradley, one of the board members, leaned forward. Mr. Morrison, we have a process. You can remove the gate now, then submit an application to build a new one. If it meets the standards, we'll approve it. And if it doesn't meet the standards, David asked, if you decide hand-carved cedar doesn't fit your vision? That's not our problem, Karen said. The covenant is clear. You have 10 days left. After that, the fines begin. David felt something shift inside him. He'd come here ready to compromise, ready to bend over backward to avoid conflict. But they weren't even willing to discuss it. They'd made up their minds, and his feelings, his memories, his property rights didn't matter to them at all. Fine, if that's how they wanted to play it. Before you start fining me, David said quietly, there's something you all need to know. I own Whisper Creek Bridge. Not the HOA, not the county. Me. The room went completely silent. People looked at each other, confused. Karen laughed, but it sounded nervous. That's ridiculous. The bridge is common property. No, it's not. David opened his folder and started handing out copies of his deed and survey map. The bridge sits on a separate parcel that was included when I bought my property. You're all welcome to check your own title reports. The bridge belongs to me. People grabbed the papers, heads bent together as they read. The room filled with whispers. So what? Tom Bradley said. There's an easement. We have the right to use it. You do, David agreed. But the easement has conditions. It allows access as long as nothing interferes with my quiet enjoyment of my property, forcing me to tear down a structure I built 12 years ago, forcing me to destroy something I made with my father before he died. I'd say that qualifies as interference. Karen stood up, her face red. This is extortion. You can't hold the entire community hostage over a stupid gate. I'm not trying to hold anyone hostage, David said. I'm trying to keep what's mine. I came here tonight to offer a compromise and you refused to even consider it. So now I'm telling you, I will give you 90 days notice to make other arrangements for access if you proceed with these fines. You wouldn't dare, Karen said. David met her eyes. Try me. He walked out of the meeting while chaos erupted behind him. He could hear people shouting, arguing, demanding to see the documents more closely. He got in his truck and drove home, his hand shaking a little on the steering wheel. Had he really just threatened to cut off access to the entire neighborhood? Was he actually going to do this? When he got home, he sat on his porch for a long time looking at his gate. The carved deer seemed to be watching him in the moonlight. He thought about his father, about the patient way he'd taught David to work with wood, to see the grain and let it guide the knife. His phone buzzed. It was a text from Karen. "What you're doing is illegal and immoral. The HOA will see you in court. You won't win." David read it twice, then set down his phone. He went inside, sat at his computer, and drafted a formal 90-day notice of easement revocation. He cited the interference clause, listed the HOA's demands as the reason, and kept the language professional and clear. He printed 3 copies, signed them, and put them in envelopes addressed to each board member. Tomorrow he'd send them certified mail. If they wanted a fight, he'd give them one. But they'd started this, not him. David sent the certified letters the next morning. 3 identical envelopes, each containing his 90-day notice of easement revocation, each addressed to a different HOA board member. The clerk at the post office gave him a curious look when he requested tracking and signature confirmation for all 3, but she didn't ask questions. By that afternoon, his phone started ringing. He didn't answer. He knew what was coming. The first email arrived around 6 p.m. It was from Karen, sent to the entire HOA mailing list. David read it twice, his jaw getting tighter with each word. "Dear Mountain View residents," it began. "It has come to the board's attention that David Morrison is attempting to extort the community by threatening to close the Whisper Creek Bridge. His claims about ownership are currently being investigated, but regardless of their validity, this represents a clear attempt to bully your board into giving him special treatment. The board will not be intimidated. We have retained legal counsel and will fight this malicious action with every resource at our disposal. We urge all residents to stand together against this selfish behavior." Selfish. That word hit David harder than he expected. He'd lived here for 12 years, never caused problems, always kept to himself. And now he was selfish for not wanting to tear down something his father had helped him build? His phone buzzed with text messages. Most were angry. A few were supportive, but those people didn't identify themselves in the group chat. They sent private messages instead, afraid of the backlash. One message came from Betty Rodriguez, one of the older residents who'd been there almost as long as David. "I never liked this HOA nonsense. Your gate is beautiful. Don't let them push you around." That helped a little, but it didn't stop what came next. 3 days after the letters went out, David came home from buying groceries to find spray paint on his gate. Big red letters spelling out "Tyrant." He stood there looking at it for a long time, feeling something cold settle in his chest. Someone had come onto his property, probably in the middle of the night, to vandalize the very thing he was fighting to protect. He took pictures, filed a police report. The officer who came out was sympathetic but honest. "Could be anyone in the development. Unless you've got security cameras, we probably won't find who did it." David didn't have cameras. He'd never needed them before. The next week, someone left a dead fish in his mailbox. Then his garbage cans got knocked over 3 nights in a row. Nothing big enough to be dangerous, but enough to let him know that people were angry. Not everyone, though. Twice he found notes tucked under his door. "Stand your ground," one said. "They had no right to demand you tear down your gate." No signatures. Just quiet support from people who didn't want to be identified. The HOA hired a lawyer, a sharp guy named Rick Patterson, who wore expensive suits and talked fast. David knew because Linda, his own lawyer, called him after receiving a lengthy letter from Patterson's office. "They're arguing that your revocation is retaliatory and won't hold up in court," Linda told him. "Patterson says you're using the easement as a weapon and that a judge will see through it." "And what do you think?" David asked. "I think you have a solid legal position, but this is going to get expensive and ugly. Are you sure you want to continue down this road?" David looked out his window at his gate, still marked with red spray paint. He'd tried to clean it, but cedar absorbed the paint deep into the grain. He'd have to sand it down and restain the whole thing. "They started this," he said. "I just want to keep what's mine." The fine started on day 15, just like the HOA had promised. $100 per day, documented in formal notices that arrived in his mailbox. David didn't pay them. Instead, he filed a countersuit arguing that the covenant couldn't be retroactively applied to structures that predated it. 2 properties went up for sale in week 3. David heard through Betty that both sellers were having trouble. The title companies had flagged the access issue. With David's revocation notice on record at the county, nobody wanted to buy a property that might lose its only access road in a few weeks. That's when things really got nasty. Karen called an emergency HOA meeting. 30 people showed up and the vote was close. But it passed. A special assessment of $5,000 per household to fund the legal battle against David. 18 voted yes. 12 voted no, but David wasn't invited to the meeting, but he heard about it within an hour. $5,000 per household meant the HOA had just raised nearly $200,000 for legal fees. This wasn't a small-town property dispute anymore. This was war. His lawyer bills were piling up too. Linda was good, but she wasn't cheap. David had savings, but he watched them dwindle with each passing week. The stress kept him up at night staring at the ceiling, wondering if he'd made a terrible mistake. But every time doubt crept in, he'd think about his father. About the patient way Dad had shown him how to carve the deer, how to make the wood come alive. About the pride in the old man's eyes when they'd set the last post and stepped back to admire their work. No, he wouldn't back down. At day 60 of the 90-day notice, the HOA filed for an emergency injunction to prevent David from closing the bridge. The hearing was scheduled for day 75. That gave both sides 2 weeks to prepare. Linda worked long hours building their case. The legal argument was straightforward. David owned the property, the easement had clear conditions, and those conditions allowed for revocation. The HOA was interfering with his quiet enjoyment. End of story. But legal arguments and real life weren't always the same thing, and David knew it. He started getting phone calls from neighbors. Not angry ones anymore. Desperate ones. A woman named Patricia called crying because she was trying to sell her house to pay for her mother's nursing home care. The sale had fallen through because of the title issue. "Please," she begged. "I understand you're upset about the gate, but my mother needs me. I can't help her if I can't sell." An older man called to tell David he had medical appointments in the city 3 times a week for dialysis. "If the bridge closes, that's an extra 2 hours of driving each time. I don't know if I can physically handle that." Each call felt like a knife twisting in David's gut. He hadn't thought about the individual stories, the real people who would be affected by this. He'd been so focused on the principle of the thing, on his right to keep his property the way he wanted it, that he hadn't considered the human cost. But then he'd remember Karen's dismissive tone, the way she'd laughed at his compromise offer, the way she'd called him selfish in that email to everyone. The spray paint on his gate, they'd done this, not him. They'd forced the situation by refusing to even talk about alternatives. Still, the calls haunted him. One evening, about day 65, his phone rang with a number he didn't recognize. He almost didn't answer, but something made him pick up. "Mr. Morrison, this is Tom Bradley, from the HOA board." David tensed. "What do you want?" "I want to apologize," Tom said. "And I want to see if we can find a way out of this mess." "Karen sent you to try and negotiate?" David asked suspiciously. "No, Karen doesn't know I'm calling. Look, some of us on the board never wanted this fight. We thought the gate thing was ridiculous from the start. But Karen pushed it through and we went along with it." "That was wrong," David sat down. "This was unexpected. So what are you saying?" "I'm saying maybe we can bring this to another board vote. Grandfather and all pre-existing structures let you keep your gate and everyone moves on. But I need to know, if we do that, will you withdraw the revocation notice?" "In a heartbeat," David said. "I never wanted any of this. I just wanted to be left alone." "Let me talk to the other board members," Tom said. "I'll call you back in a few days." But Tom never got the chance. Karen found out about his phone call, probably because someone saw it on his phone bill or heard him talking about it. She called another emergency meeting and demanded his resignation for negotiating with the enemy behind the board's back. Tom quit the board that night. So did another member, a quiet guy named Phil, who said he was tired of the whole thing. 2 board members down, and Karen more determined than ever to win. She sent another community-wide email calling David a bully and urging everyone to stay strong. David showed the email to Linda. "Is there anything I can do about this? She's basically libeling me to the whole neighborhood." "You could sue her for defamation," Linda said. "But that's another lawsuit, more money, more stress." "Is that really what you want?" David didn't answer. He didn't know what he wanted anymore. except maybe to go back in time and never buy a property with an HOA anywhere near it. The hearing date approached. 75 days after David sent his revocation notice, both sides would present their cases to a judge. Whoever won would effectively control the future of 38 families. No pressure at all. The courthouse was packed. David arrived 30 minutes early and still had to squeeze past people in the hallway. He recognized most of them from the development, their faces tight with worry or anger. Nobody made eye contact with him. Linda met him outside the courtroom carrying 2 heavy briefcases full of documents. She'd been working 18-hour days preparing for this hearing, and it showed. Dark circles under her eyes, hair pulled back in a messy bun, coffee stains on her blouse. "How are you holding up?" she asked. "I've been better," David admitted. He'd barely slept in 3 days. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Patricia crying on the phone about her mother. Heard the dialysis patient's weak voice asking how he'd managed the extra driving. "Judge Hendricks is fair but no nonsense," Linda said. "She'll cut through the emotional arguments and focus on the law. That's good for us. Our case is solid." Rick Patterson, the HOA's lawyer, arrived with Karen and 3 other board members. They looked confident, almost smug. Patterson wore another expensive suit, this one navy blue, and carried a single slim folder. He saw David and Linda and gave them a nod that wasn't quite friendly, but wasn't hostile either. Just professional acknowledgement. The bailiff called them in at exactly 9 a.m. Judge Hendricks was a woman in her 60s with steel gray hair and reading glasses perched on her nose. She looked at both sides with the expression of someone who'd seen every type of property dispute imaginable and wasn't impressed by any of them. "Let's be clear about what we're here for," she said, before anyone could speak. "This is a hearing on the HOA's request for an emergency injunction to prevent Mr. Morrison from revoking an easement. I've reviewed the filings from both sides. Mr. Patterson, you may begin." Patterson stood and launched into his argument. He was good, David had to admit. He painted David as a vindictive property owner, using a technicality to punish his neighbors over a petty dispute. He talked about the 38 families who would be stranded, the property values that would collapse, the hardship and suffering that would result. "Your Honor," Patterson said, gesturing dramatically, "Mr. Morrison is attempting to use his ownership of this bridge as a weapon. He's holding an entire community hostage because the HOA asked him to follow the same rules everyone else follows. This isn't about property rights. It's about retaliation, pure and simple." He presented testimony from several residents. Patricia talked about her mother's nursing home situation, tears running down her face. The dialysis patient, Mr. Chen, explained his medical needs in a shaky voice. A young mother testified that she couldn't get her kids to school if the bridge closed. David felt sick listening to all of it. These were real people with real problems, and he was making their lives harder. But then Karen took the stand and his sympathy evaporated. She talked about community standards and property values, about the importance of rules and order. She never once mentioned that David had offered to compromise, never acknowledged that the gate had existed long before the HOA, never admitted that maybe, just maybe, they could have handled this differently. "Mr. Morrison thinks he's above the rules," Karen said, looking directly at the judge. "He thinks because he got here first, he doesn't have to follow the same standards as everyone else. That's not how communities work." When Patterson finished, Judge Hendricks turned to Linda. "Ms. Chen?" Linda stood. She didn't make dramatic gestures or raise her voice. She just laid out the facts methodically and clearly. David owned the bridge parcel. That wasn't in dispute. The deed was right there in black and white. The easement granted access, but it had explicit conditions. Those conditions allowed revocation if the property owner's quiet enjoyment was interfered with. The HOA demanded that Mr. Morrison destroy a structure he built 12 years ago with his late father, Linda said. A structure that harms no one, blocks nothing, and existed long before any covenant applied to it. When Mr. Morrison offered reasonable compromises, the HOA refused to even discuss them. They gave him 2 choices: destroy something precious to him, or face crippling daily fines. She pulled out the spray paint photos, the police reports about the vandalism, copies of Karen's community-wide emails calling David selfish and a bully. "The HOA claims Mr. Morrison is retaliating," Linda continued, "but retaliation implies he struck first. He didn't. He built a gate on his own property over a decade ago. The HOA came after him. When he tried to negotiate, they refused. When he exercised his legal rights, they called him names and filed lawsuits. Who exactly is retaliating against whom here? She sat down. The courtroom was silent. Judge Hendricks looked at David. Mr. Morrison, do you have anything you'd like to say? David hadn't expected to be asked to speak. Linda had told him to stay quiet and let her handle it. But now the judge was looking at him, waiting. He stood up, his legs shaky. Your Honor, I don't want to hurt anyone. I really don't. All those people who testified, I heard them. I know this is affecting their lives, and that tears me up inside. He took a breath. But that gate, it's the last thing I built with my dad before cancer took him. Every time I drive through it, I remember his hands guiding mine with the carving knife. I remember him laughing when I messed up a deer antler and had to start over. I remember the look on his face when we stepped back and saw what we'd made together. His voice cracked a little and he cleared his throat. The HOA could have worked with me. I offered to stain it their color. I offered to modify it however they wanted as long as I could keep the basic structure. They said no. They said tear it down or pay $100 every single day until you do. They didn't care what it meant to me. They didn't care about compromise. They just wanted control. He looked at Karen, who was staring at her hands. I exercised my legal rights because I had no other option. If that makes me selfish, then I guess I'm selfish. But I think people have a right to keep what's theirs, especially when it's not hurting anyone. He sat back down. Linda gave him a small nod. Judge Hendricks was quiet for a long moment, reading through documents. The only sound in the courtroom was the clock ticking and someone's nervous cough. Finally, she looked up. Here's what I'm seeing. Mr. Morrison clearly owns the bridge parcel. The property records are unambiguous. The easement agreement's terms are explicit and legally binding. Mr. Morrison has the right to revoke that easement under the conditions specified. Patterson started to stand, but the judge held up a hand. However, she continued, I'm troubled by what appears to be a disproportionate response to a dispute over a decorative gate. Mr. Patterson, your argument about retaliation has some merit, Ms. Chen. Your argument about legal rights also has merit. Both of you are correct, which means neither of you is entirely right. She took off her glasses and set them on the bench. I'm not going to issue the injunction today. Mr. Morrison's revocation notice stands. However, I'm going to give both parties 60 days to negotiate a settlement. If you can reach an agreement, file it with the court and we're done. If you can't, we'll reconvene and I'll make a final ruling. Your Honor, Patterson said quickly, what happens if they can't agree and you rule in Mr. Morrison's favor? Then the easement is revoked and the HOA will need to find alternative access or purchase the bridge parcel from Mr. Morrison at fair market value. Karen's face went pale. Fair market value for the only access point to a 38-home development would be astronomical. Hundreds of thousands, maybe millions. The HOA couldn't afford that. 60 days, Judge Hendricks repeated. Use them wisely. This court is adjourned. Everyone stood as the judge left. David felt simultaneously relieved and terrified. He had 60 days. But 60 days to do what? Karen wouldn't negotiate with him, not after this. As people filed out of the courtroom, David caught sight of Tom Bradley in the back row. The former board member gave him a slight nod before disappearing into the crowd. Outside, Linda put a hand on David's shoulder. That was the best outcome we could have hoped for. The judge basically told the HOA they need to settle or face financial ruin. But will they settle? David asked. Karen would rather burn the whole place down than admit she was wrong. Maybe, Linda said. But she's not the only one on that board. And I'm guessing a lot of residents are going to have strong opinions about this after today. She was right about that. By the time David got home, his phone was already buzzing with messages. Some angry, some supportive, all of them intense. The question now was whether 60 days would be enough time for people to come to their senses, or whether this whole thing would blow up even bigger than before. The first week after the hearing was chaos. David's phone rang constantly with people wanting to yell at him, reason with him, or occasionally thank him. The community was split down the middle and everyone had an opinion. Karen sent out another email, this one claiming the judge's ruling was a temporary setback and urging everyone to stay strong. She insisted the HOA would prevail in the end, but behind the scenes things were falling apart. 3 more board members resigned in the week following the hearing. 2 of them sent David private messages apologizing for going along with Karen's approach. The third just quietly submitted his resignation letter and stopped answering emails. That left Karen and one other board member, a guy named Doug who mostly just nodded along with whatever Karen said. They couldn't make quorum for official votes anymore. The HOA was effectively paralyzed, and the legal bills kept piling up. The special assessment had raised close to $200,000, but Rick Patterson was burning through it fast. Some residents started demanding to see the accounting. How much were they paying this lawyer? What were they getting for their money? David wasn't doing much better financially. Linda's bills were stacking up on his kitchen counter. He'd already gone through most of his savings, and there was no end in sight. Some nights he lay awake wondering if he should just give up, tear down the gate, and end this nightmare. But then he'd walk outside and see those hand-carved deer and birds, see his father's craftsmanship in every line and curve, and he'd know he couldn't do it. The breakthrough came on day 8 of the 60-day deadline. Betty Rodriguez called an unofficial community meeting at her house. She didn't ask the HOA board's permission, didn't go through official channels. She just sent out an email saying anyone who wanted to find a solution should come by on Saturday afternoon. 40 people showed up. That was more than the HOA had ever gotten to an official meeting. Betty stood in her living room and said what everyone was thinking, but nobody wanted to admit. We're going broke fighting over a wooden gate. This is the stupidest thing I've ever seen in 50 years of living in this community. A few people laughed nervously. Karen's not here, Betty continued, and neither is Doug. They can't stop us from talking. So let's talk. What would it take to end this? A woman named Helen spoke up. Someone needs to apologize to David. We came after him for no good reason. He's going to bankrupt us all, someone else argued. He needs to back down. Why should he? Tom Bradley said from the back of the room. Everyone turned to look at him. He tried to compromise. We told him to go to hell. Now he's got leverage and suddenly we want him to be reasonable. That's not how it works. The arguments went on for 2 hours. People were angry, frustrated, scared about their property values and their access and their investment in this place. But slowly a consensus started to form. The gate wasn't the problem. It had never been the problem. The problem was the HOA's rigid approach, the unwillingness to grandfather in existing structures, the attitude that rules mattered more than common sense. By the end of the meeting, a proposal had emerged: remove Karen and Doug from the board, hold emergency elections, and have the new board negotiate directly with David to keep his gate in exchange for maintaining the easement. Who's going to tell Karen? Someone asked. I will, Tom said. I already quit once. Might as well finish the job. The next day, a petition started circulating. It called for a special election to recall the entire HOA board and elect new leadership. Within 48 hours, it had signatures from 2/3 of the homeowners. Karen fought it. She sent angry emails claiming the petition was invalid, that people were being manipulated, that this was all David's doing. But the more she fought, the more people turned against her. They were tired of the drama, tired of the legal bills, tired of fighting over something that should never have been an issue in the first place. The recall vote was held 2 weeks after the court hearing. Karen and Doug both lost by huge margins. Tom Bradley was elected as the new president, along with Betty Rodriguez and 3 other longtime residents who'd been vocal about finding a reasonable solution. Tom called David the next morning. Let's end this, Tom said. No more lawyers, no more fighting. Just 2 neighbors working out a deal. They met at Betty's house that afternoon. Tom brought the new board members. David came alone, though Linda had offered to join him. Somehow it felt like this needed to be just neighbors talking, not lawyers negotiating. Tom laid it out simply. We want to amend the covenant to grandfather in all pre-existing structures. Your gate stays, no modifications needed. Any other structure that was built before the covenant gets the same protection. In exchange, you maintain the easement and we all move on with our lives. That's it? David asked. No conditions, no demands that I make changes? That's it, Betty said. Your gate is beautiful. We should have told you that 12 years ago and left you alone. David felt something loosen in his chest, a tension he'd been carrying for months. I'll have Linda draw up the paperwork today. We can file it with the court this week. Tom stuck out his hand. David shook it. I'm sorry it came to this, Tom said. A lot of us are. Karen had good intentions, but she couldn't see past the rules to the people behind them. Where is Karen now? David asked. She listed her house for sale yesterday, Betty said quietly. I think the shame of it all was too much. She couldn't face everyone after losing the recall. David felt a complicated mix of emotions about that. He hadn't wanted to drive anyone out of the community. But then again, Karen had started this whole mess by refusing to compromise. Linda drew up the settlement agreement that night. It was straightforward. The covenant was amended to protect all pre-existing structures. David's easement remained in full force, and both sides agreed to drop all pending legal actions and pay their own attorney fees. They filed it with Judge Hendricks on day 23 of the 60-day deadline. She approved it without a hearing, probably relieved that she wouldn't have to make the final ruling herself. The legal notices went up at the county courthouse. The title issues cleared. The 2 properties that had been stuck in limbo finally sold. Patricia was able to help her mother. Mr. Chen kept going to dialysis without adding 2 hours to his drive. Life in Mountain View slowly returned to normal. David hired a professional to clean and restore his gate, removing the spray paint and restaining the whole thing. It took the guy 3 days, but when he finished, the gate looked better than ever. The carved animals seemed to stand out more clearly, the wood grain rich and warm in the afternoon sun. A few neighbors stopped by while the work was being done. Some apologized for the things that had been said, the vandalism, the angry messages. David accepted their apologies, though some wounds would take longer to heal than others. Betty brought him homemade cookies and sat on his porch for an hour, just talking about nothing in particular. It felt good to have a friend in the community again. The HOA's legal bills had topped $150,000 by the time everything was settled. David's had hit $90,000. Money neither side would ever get back, all spent fighting over a wooden gate that should have been left alone in the first place. The new board held a community meeting a month after the settlement. Tom stood up and talked about lessons learned. "We forgot what neighborhoods are supposed to be about," he said. "We got so focused on rules and property values that we forgot about the people living here. Rules are important, but they're supposed to serve us, not control us." He proposed new guidelines. Any structure existing before the HOA covenant would be automatically protected. Any new structure would need approval, but the board would focus on whether it actually harmed the community, not just whether it checked every box on a list. People actually applauded. Karen's house sold in early fall. David heard she moved 2 counties over, somewhere without an HOA. He felt a little bad about that, but mostly he felt relieved that the constant conflict was finally over. 6 months after the settlement, David was working in his workshop when he heard a car pull up. He walked outside to find Tom standing by the gate, running his hand over the carved deer. "Your dad did this?" Tom asked. "We did it together," David said. "That was his design, my hands. Or sometimes my design, his hands. We kind of collaborated on the whole thing." "It's really beautiful," Tom said. "I should have said that when I first joined the board, instead of treating it like a problem to solve." They stood there for a while, just looking at the gate. "You ever regret how this all went down?" Tom asked. David thought about it. The stress, the money, the months of conflict and sleepless nights. But then he looked at the gate, still standing, still welcoming visitors with its carved wildlife and smooth cedar posts. "No," he said finally. "I don't regret standing up for what mattered to me. I wish it hadn't been necessary, but I don't regret it." Tom nodded. "For what it's worth, I think a lot of people learned something from this. We learned that flexibility matters more than rigid rules, that people's memories and history deserve respect. That being technically right doesn't always mean you're doing the right thing." After Tom left, David walked down to the bridge. His bridge, technically, though he'd never think of it that way again. He stood in the middle of it, looking at the creek flowing underneath. "Listen,